by some very tough people, and they use tear gas. And here's the bottom line. Nobody's coming into our country unless they come in legally.
Scary stuff. Okay, so in light of the US government shutdown, there's been endless talk about the border wall. Trump originally said, blame me for the shutdown, and the Democrats were like, okay. Now that the shutdown's been going on for a month and everyone fucking hates it, Trump is blaming the Democrats now? Now it's their fault? I guess this really is US politics. I guess when thousands of federal employees started getting their pay furloughed and things like food stamps are about to run out, Trump realized people don't like the shutdown over the border wall where there's no real national security issue. Now, in order to convince the American people that there is a national emergency, he might just declare one in order to get border wall funding. Tons of people have pointed out that holding the American people hostage and pretending there's a national emergency to get what he wants looks pretty fucking authoritarian. The Republicans just go right along with this. Now, funny enough, Trump and I actually do have agreement about the fact that there is a crisis at the border, but I just think it's immigration and customs enforcement. Since Donald Trump took office, and yes, before, there have been numerous cases of horrific things from child sex abuse to people dying of completely preventable diseases, all while in the custody of ICE. Of course, a lot of conservatives don't care about that. If you can just call them illegals, I guess it doesn't matter what happens to them, right? You can justify anything that happens to someone you dehumanize. Okay, so ignoring the fact that a lot of these people aren't even doing something illegal, they're just applying for asylum at legal points of entry, let's run down why conservatives think there's a crisis at the border. So their biggest talking points seem to be,
they're bringing drugs, they're bringing crime, they're rapists.
So I guess we have to look into that. Okay, so study after study shows that immigrants, documented or undocumented, are basically less likely to commit crimes than native-born citizens. A particular study I want to look at is one by the Cato Institute on immigrant crime in Texas. And yeah, I know, the fucking Cato Institute, but please hear me out. The reason they look at Texas specifically is that it's the only state that actually records the immigration status of criminals. Now with this graph, we can see that native-born citizens have the highest conviction rate for homicides in Texas, with undocumented immigrants being the next largest group. Now, undocumented immigrants look like a pretty big threat with this graph, but it's important to keep in mind that this is per every 100,000 members of a particular subpopulation, meaning that native-born citizens are actually a much larger threat. This next graph, comparing percentage of the population to percentage of homicide convictions, shows this even more starkly. Native-born citizens are the only group that are overrepresented in homicide statistics, and undocumented immigrants are an incredibly tiny sliver of the population. Trump has a little bit more credence when he says,
they're rapists.
When you look at this graph, as undocumented immigrants account for a higher number of sex crimes than they do for all other crimes, but even this still doesn't compare to the number of sex crimes committed by native-born citizens. This last graph very clearly shows that for all crimes in Texas, native-born citizens far outdo any other group. So the idea that immigrants are bringing crime is not only unfounded, but absurd fear-mongering. In an ABC article citing this Cato Institute paper, they also point out that Trump likes to use the arrest numbers of undocumented immigrants as opposed to conviction rates, giving the impression that they pose this huge dangerous threat, which is incredibly deceptive. Now, even though the Cato Institute is a right-wing think tank, it's kind of a libertarian think tank, and libertarians tend to be kind of pro-immigration. It must all just be a bunch of fake news. But to be fair, I normally wouldn't trust the Cato Institute's findings on literally anything, so why don't we look into something else? Okay, so some of the stuff I'm going to be talking about here is from the Migration Policy Institute. The link for this paper is going to be in the description, as well as the Cato Institute study and the ABC article. One of the first things the Migration Policy Institute talks about is how interest in walls kind of fluctuates over time. And right now, in the last 30 years, as globalization and wealth inequality have been exacerbated, they've had kind of a renaissance. They also talk about how the Great Wall of China is normally held up as a, look, walls work, by people who are, let's just say, wall proponents. What's really interesting, and I actually didn't know any of this, is that there's records of the Chinese building multiple walls over their very long history. The one we Westerners call the Great Wall, not the one the Chinese called the Great Wall, was built during the Ming Dynasty in the 16th century. For some perspective, the Ming Dynasty came after the Mongolian Yuan Dynasty ruled over everywhere. Now, most of the time, these walls went up to prevent Mongol raids, but generally they were pretty ineffective at doing this. The walls would then fall into disarray after a few decades and be seen as gigantic failures. The Great Wall was actually mostly rebuilt by the modern Chinese government, and it's just a thing for Westerners to gawk at since we seem to love walls so much. And what is this love of walls anyway? Sometimes we pretend it's a jobs issue, but I think people like Laura Ingraham and Tucker Carlson really show that it's just about fear of change. Fear of demographic change. Fear of being replaced. It's really telling how fast you can go from it's a jobs issue and a crime issue into great replacement and white genocide conspiracy theories. And it's also really telling that Fox News at this point is basically just spouting that bullshit. Tucker Carlson in particular seems to just be spouting off literal Nazi conspiracy theories. Like, what the fuck is this? Okay. Back on track. The Migration Policy Institute has a couple of findings on walls. The first thing is that walls that are short in length and constantly guarded are generally pretty effective. Walls also tend to shift the flow of migration routes to more dangerous routes instead of actually slowing down the number of people who try to get somewhere. For example, a lot of people know that the Bush administration actually put up walls along key sections of the US-Mexico border. What this led to was an increase in migrant deaths, not less people trying to get here. If that's the kind of outcome you're okay with, you're not a good person. This is not a humanitarian solution. This is sweeping it under the rug. This is, I don't want to deal with it. And this is, I don't care about the motivating factors behind why people try to come here. I just care about getting rid of them. Also, they dispel the myth that, like, the wall is gonna prevent drugs from getting here, because that's ridiculous. Drugs come into this country through legal points of entry. These people are already sneaking past our surveillance. The wall isn't gonna change anything. But the biggest reason that the wall is a waste of time is that it won't even really stop a ton of undocumented immigrants. The undocumented immigrants in this country, for the most part, they came on planes, they had visas, and they just didn't leave when their visas expired. This wall isn't going to change any of that. Most of the people coming through the desert are people who are fleeing violence and then applying for asylum. Instead of sending people down who could have helped them apply for asylum, maybe help them understand the English documents, we sent the fucking military to throw tear gas into another sovereign country. They were throwing this at families, at people who are fleeing violence. The wall is just a huge waste of money, and the $5 billion Trump is asking for is laughably low for what will actually be needed. $5 billion might get walls put up in some little sections, but that's not going to give you any surveillance. That's not going to get anyone watching it, which means the walls are just going to be ineffective. And for what? To stop some of the undocumented immigrants? I mean, just think about something like the Berlin Wall. Not only did it need constant surveillance and was kind of seen as a sign of brutality by the international community, but a bunch of people still managed to get past it. Walls are surprisingly ineffective at stopping migration, and honestly, at this point, I think the Republicans just want a big authoritarian symbol they can point at to help them feel safe. Okay, but they don't pay taxes, and they're just sitting around collecting welfare and contributing to the crumbling of our nation's infrastructure. Well, that's actually not true. Lots of undocumented immigrants pay taxes. In fact, almost all of them pay taxes, and a good number of them pay federal income tax. Okay, so here I'm gonna cite a really long-ass paper by the National Research Council, which again, I'll put in the description. In one of the most comprehensive analyses to date on the costs and benefits of immigrants to the US economy, the National Research Council concluded that immigrants add as much as $10 billion to the economy each year, and that immigrants will pay, on average, $80,000 per capita more in taxes than they use in government services over their lifetimes. So immigrants aren't really a strain on the economy at all. In fact, they add to the economy. That might seem counterintuitive at first, but think about it this way. Who's the bigger strain on the economy? Someone who's born here, attends publicly funded schools, and is completely dependent on their parents for 18 years? Or an adult migrant who comes here to work and is less likely to use public services in the first place? It seems pretty obvious to me. I do want to add, though, that I don't think it's a good thing that immigrants are less likely to use things like health services. That's kind of a massive public health problem. A public health problem that could be solved by universal healthcare. That's right, that's the answer. Universal healthcare. You know, the thing that every other country figured out is cheaper and better than a private fragmented healthcare system. Okay, but aren't we a nation of laws? Shouldn't we enforce our laws? Well, I think it's slightly more complicated than that, and it comes down to the fact that we have kind of a federalized system. As an example, I want to talk about sanctuary cities, and here I'll be summarizing a video by Vox Media titled How Sanctuary Cities Actually Work. Let's say an undocumented immigrant gets arrested for literally anything. It doesn't matter what it is. When they're brought in, they get fingerprinted, and that fingerprint data is sent first to the FBI and then to Immigration and Customs Enforcement. This happens whether or not you're in a sanctuary city. They can't avoid that. ICE gets this fingerprint data, and then they look and say, oh, this is an undocumented immigrant in our records. ICE then sends a detainer request to the police department asking them to hold that person for an additional 48 hours so ICE can come pick them up and deport them. Now, the thing about this detainer request is it's It's just a request. The police department, being under their city's jurisdiction, is under no obligation to actually follow an order by ICE because that's federal jurisdiction. You can see the same dynamic at play when a state legalizes marijuana, but distributors still have to act in secrecy to avoid being found out by federal DEA agents. Every city and county in the United States has different restrictions on what level the police department is allowed to cooperate with immigration enforcement, and there's a reason for this. If your police department is known for cooperating with ICE and deporting people, immigrant communities will not cooperate with the police, and that's a huge problem. Even when they're the victims of a crime, many immigrants won't call the police because of the danger it poses to either themselves or to people that they know. This basically comes down to a conservative's favorite argument: states' rights. I guess it's only their favorite argument when it backs up bigotry. Anyway, because of the 10th Amendment, sanctuary cities aren't violating the law, no matter what a conservative tells you. On top of this, they're actually used as a way to make communities safer because large-scale government crackdowns on targeted communities generally don't work that well. Just ask the war on drugs. Goddamn, conservatives just love to cry states' rights when it's convenient for them and then back up massive federal government crackdowns that go right in the face of states' rights when it's against people that they don't like. But what about violent gangs like MS-13? Well, funny enough, MS-13 is actually an American problem. MS-13 popped up in Los Angeles in the 1980s, and the reason they gained traction is because the immigrant community didn't feel like they could trust the police. And you know what? They were kinda right. But why were there so many Central American immigrants here to begin with? Well, it goes back to the CIA, our favorite organization that loves to overthrow governments around the world. In 1954, the CIA, at the request of the United Fruit Company, helped overthrow democratically elected President Jacobo Arbenz in Guatemala. You see, his policies threatened the United Fruit Company, and capitalism will literally destroy you if you threaten it. This destabilization of the Guatemalan government led to a 36-year civil war and a massive wave of migrants from that country. The US government, instead of dealing with this problem that they created by extending citizenship to the people who came here, they decided to crack down on these communities, and that is what led to the rise of MS-13. So we deported a lot of the MS-13 people back to Guatemala. Of course, they kind of continued the civil unrest in Guatemala, and now we have a new wave of migrants that have been coming up since the early 2000s. And you know what? Our government can do the right thing. We can extend citizenship to these people and try and stop this cycle from continuing. Oh no, we'll just fucking deport them and keep this going, because we like to sweep problems under the rug instead of try and actually deal with them. Are you starting to see how this is maybe the United States' fault? The saddest thing is, all these conservatives are terrified of violent gangs coming up here, but that's not the people who are coming here. The people coming here are people who are terrified of those violent gangs and civil unrest in their country. They're people just like you and me who just want a safe place to sleep at night. And they're fleeing a problem that the US government created. So the least we could do is try to fucking help them out. You know, at some point it becomes incredibly obvious that this wall is just a big racist stunt. No one's proposing a wall on the US-Canada border, and just look at these fucking tweets. We're finding prayer rugs and Korans out in the desert. What the fuck kind of anecdotal bullshit is this? Even if you are finding these things, why is that a bad thing? You know, Muslims actually aren't coming here to hurt you. I guess disdain for Mexicans isn't enough for these people, so they have to spice in their hatred of Muslims too. God damn, 9/11 really fucked this country up. I'm not saying we didn't have a ton of hatred of Muslims before, but it got so much worse after that. God, conservatives just love to play on the fear that immigrants are gonna come here and hurt us, that people of color are gonna come here and hurt us. But also, I don't want to let the Democrats off the hook. Hillary did in fact support a border wall in 2015, and only when Donald Trump was her contender did she start changing her rhetoric. In 2014, Barack Obama was responsible for more deportations than George Bush was in his entire 8 years. Also in 2014, Barack Obama went down to Mexico, working with the Mexican president to try and secure the Guatemalan border. It's fucking ridiculous. Even when the Democrats do what you want, it's not good enough. You have to have a giant fucking racist monument so that you can be happy. Okay, so I've shown you all a bunch of nice numbers, and if you're a liberal or maybe a centrist, that's probably good enough for your argument. But unlike liberals, I'm not really interested in making the case that immigrants can come to this country and just do the work that Americans won't do and for really low wages. I'm not interested in using migrants as a way of propping up the economy so our rich white people's lives can be better. And Democrats, you have a fucking terrible track record on immigration. You are not helping anything. So let's talk about what leftists think. So I'm a socialist, and by definition, socialists are internationalists. You know, we say things like, workers of the world unite. This internationalist stance is the reason that most leftists are pro-immigrant and pro-refugee, because we don't see national or racial distinctions as important. Instead, we see all people, outside of the capitalists, as part of the same struggle. the struggle of the working class. And a good socialist will do anything in their power to not play into stereotypes or ideas that divide the working class. A lot of socialists don't even want to have distinctions like citizen, documented immigrant, undocumented immigrant, as they see these as being inherently divisive and harmful. If we're going to build up a movement of international solidarity, we're not going to get there by putting up walls. We're going to get there by realizing that our enemy is not immigrants. It's not people of color. It's not queer people. It's not trans people. It's the capitalists. There is one okay argument that the conservatives have about immigration, and it's that sometimes immigrants, if there's a big enough wave of them, can lower wages. But why is that the case? That's not the immigrants' fault. Why would you blame the immigrants? Blame the capitalist who actually lowers your wage. They're taking advantage of you. The immigrant is just doing the best they can in their situation, but a capitalist? The capitalist doesn't give a shit about you. They will do whatever they can to increase their profits. Instead of walls, you should be advocating for union control of workplaces, because if unions control workplaces, immigrants can't come here and lower wages. The economy fundamentally does not work like that. This harkens back to a point I made in my first video that sometimes conservatives can see the problems that are created by capitalism, but their solution is always within capitalism. It's never some fundamental transforming of the system. And that is why their solutions are always so bad. And I don't blame them for this fully. I mean, it's easier to play the anti-immigrant game. The anti-capitalism game doesn't give you an easy enemy, and it doesn't give you a nice tangible solution like a wall that you can put up. Instead, you have to play a kind of weird abstract game where you talk about capital and how it affects everyone. Of course, I don't have a ton of sympathy for the right, because the fear that's been stoked in them has led them to justify horrible things. People are dying in the custody of ICE. Horrible things are happening. Children are getting ripped from their parents, and that was happening under the Obama administration. It got worse under the Trump administration. It doesn't matter what president did it. It was a bad thing. But who cares, right? They're just illegals. God, that's an incredible way of sweeping under the rug a very humanitarian issue and handing it over to a very hostile federal government. That seems like the exact sort of thing conservatives shouldn't like. If you really are the party of small government, why the fuck are you advocating for this? That border clash in Tijuana was fucking ridiculous, and you know it. You're always going to look like the bad guy if you're throwing tear gas at families. People on the right, is this really your enemy? Is this who you're afraid of? This reaction to asylum seekers is fucking pathetic and brutal, and for what? So you can pretend you're doing something about drugs and crime? Stop pretending this is about drugs and crime. Stop using single issues of migrant crime like the death of Molly Tibbetts to justify treating real human beings like garbage. Her family even asked you all to stop doing that. ICE is an evil organization that is ruining the lives of migrants because it is beneficial to capitalists. It is beneficial to people like Donald Trump for you to have blind, unwavering support for the United States of America, no matter what he does to you. To the conservatives watching this, you have much more in common with these immigrants than you ever will with Donald Trump. These migrants aren't your enemy. The capitalists are. Donald Trump isn't one of you. He's a poser. He doesn't know how much soap costs at Kroger. He thinks you need an ID to buy groceries because he's actually never done it before. He's never worried about where his next meal is coming from. He's never worried about paying rent. He's never worried about paying medical bills. He's a rich child who's been coddled by his billionaire family for his entire life. Now he's taking advantage of nationalistic, racist rhetoric because he thinks you're foolish enough to buy anti-immigrant arguments while he does nothing to help you. He talked about bringing the jobs back while GM just laid off thousands of workers. Stop letting him take advantage of you. Stop letting billionaires tell you how they think the world should work and start listening to marginalized communities. Our culture is not that different from Central America's. We're all capitalist countries and we have majority Christian populations, and the only real division between us are the arbitrary lines that divide our countries. Stop letting that stand in your way. Stand with us, and just maybe we have a shot at taking down the ruling class who are truly responsible for the mess that we're in. Well, right as I'm about to upload the video, the shutdown is over. Congratulations to all the airline workers who, grounded all the flights out of LaGuardia and got the government to actually do something about this. At least until I think it's February 15th. If you enjoyed this big fucking rant, please like, subscribe, hit the notification bell, do all the good things, and I promise in the next video I won't fuck with my watch the whole time.